Hello. We are about to continue reading Part 1 of Echo, beginning with Chapter 9. This is the book Echo by Pam Munoz Ryan. So, let's take a deep breath in and exhale. And let's begin. I know we ended with a cliffhanger. Chapter 9. Frederick and Elizabeth sat across from Father, who rested the cold tea kettle on the table between his hands. He took a deep breath. Your mother went into labor in the middle of the night. Dr. Braun and his nurse came to the house. Immediately after you were born, you began to have seizures. Dr. Braun said they were so severe you wouldn't make it through the night. Before the nurse left, she made the ink prints as a gesture of comfort, something your mother could keep. But then you did make it through the night. And the next, and the one after that. A few months later, it was your mother who began to fail. Father's eyes watered. Why have you never said anything, asked Frederick, about the epilepsy? From her hospital bed, your mother made me promise not to tell anyone. Each week, your birthmark had become more prominent, as did the gossip and superstition. Mrs. von Gerber was convinced your mother spilled a glass of red wine on her stomach when she was pregnant, and that caused the mark. The clerk at the bakery said your mother had a horrible fright before you were born, and the shock made the stain on your face. I remember, said Elizabeth, and a gypsy on the street thought it was a sign of a blood secret, something in our family's history that was never brought to light. It's all nonsense, said Father. Your mother did not drink wine. She feared nothing, nor did she carry any unspeakable family knowledge. But she was worried for you, Frederick. She had an aunt with the same type of birthmark, and knew that it would be burden enough. Adding the stigma of epilepsy would be too much. Confused, Frederick looked at Elizabeth. Stigma? More old wives' tales, she said. Some people think that convulsions are caused by demons or insanity, and that it's not just a medical condition. But that's ignorant conjecture. So you see why your mother begged me and Dr. Braun to keep the seizures a secret, and we promised. To be quite honest, I had forgotten about them. You never had another seizure after you were a year old. Frederick had seen an epileptic fit once, when he was in kindergarten. He'd been painting at an easel when the boy next to him dropped to the ground. The brush the boy had been holding flew across the room. He made a gagging sound, and his entire body contorted and shook. His hands clenched into fists and turned inward towards his body. He howled like an animal. For a few seconds, the boy did look insane, as if he'd been possessed by demons. But it all stopped as quickly as it had started. The teacher had ordered all the children outside. When they came back into the classroom, the boy was gone. Frederick never saw him again. Could Frederick have a seizure when he least expected it? What if he had one during his audition? Would the conservatory want him if they knew? Was he insane? He rubbed his temples. Father held the tea kettle out to him. We could all use some tea. Frederick took the kettle, carried it to the stove, and lit the fire. Elizabeth frowned. The seizures were probably febrile from a fever. But even so, I'm sure Dr. Braun wrote everything down in a chart. It's standard procedure. She pushed away from the table, stood, and began to pace, her brow furrowed in concentration. Father shook his head. What does it matter? Dr. Braun promised he would never say a word, and he hasn't. Father, regardless, there would still be a record. Don't you see, said Elizabeth, Frederick has a birthmark. That is a physical deformity we now know runs in the family. You said yourself, Mother has an aunt with the same affliction, and now there's a record of epilepsy, which is also considered hereditary. The new law is specific. Which new law? Frederick asked. Elizabeth looked at her father. You haven't told him? Father, I wrote you about it 2 months ago. The tea kettle spurted. I've read it. He's not a candidate, said Father. He was always a candidate with the birthmark alone, said Elizabeth, and now with epilepsy it is certain. I've been briefed about the law at length at the hospital, and... Frederick slammed his hand on the counter. Stop talking about me as if I'm not here. I'm not a baby anymore. What law? Candidate for what? Elizabeth crossed her arms. The law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring. It passed in July. Doctors have until January to report patients with physical deformities or hereditary conditions. Most will need an operation to prevent them from ever having children, so as not to pass along the undesirable traits. Frederick looked at Father. Surgery? You will not have this surgery, said Father. Elizabeth looked at her father as if he were a small child. He won't have a choice. Every doctor has been ordered to report all of their patients with physical deformities, alcoholism, mental illness, blindness, deafness, epilepsy. There's a list of transgressions. Frederick has committed no crime. The conditions, should they be passed on, said Elizabeth, would be transgressions against future German citizens. That's why there's a new law to prevent them from ever happening again. Frederick had an unnatural sensation in his stomach, the way he used to feel immediately before someone was about to punch him on the playground. Questions swam in his mind. Was his face a crime? Wasn't there more to him than his birthmark and an illness he no longer had? What would happen to him if he was too dreadful for the Nazis? You endorse this new law? Father asked. I understand it, said Elizabeth. Dr. Braun will be required to report Frederick. And me too, since the epilepsy and birthmark have shown in my family. I'll volunteer for the surgery. It's the least I can do for my country. And I'll be congratulated for it. Frederick should do the same. Frederick stared at Elizabeth. Was she really turning the surgery into an opportunity to improve her patriotism? And she wanted him to have it too? Father's face reddened, and he choked on his words. There is already speculation about how many will actually survive this surgery. Who is to say they won't just kill people the Nazis think are undesirable to create Hitler's so-called pure race? Frederick felt the blood drain from his face. Father? Don't worry, son. I'll make an appointment and talk to Dr. Braun myself. That's a good idea. Elizabeth gripped the back of the chair. And when I'm around, Father, I request that you speak favorably of Hitler, or say nothing. I need to believe that you might join the party, so that when I am questioned about my family by my superiors, and I will be questioned, I can say that I have no reason to suspect you of opposition. If I have to admit that you are not a follower, it might not bode well. What? Frederick couldn't believe what he heard. You would report your own father? Elizabeth raised her chin. The party rewards those who are forthright. If there were dissenters in my family and I didn't reveal it when I was questioned, it would affect my position within the League, and that could affect my work at the hospital. My career would be over. It would be the ruination of me. The ruination of you? Said Frederick. What about Father? They're putting people who don't agree with Hitler in prison, where they work them to death. What about me? They could kill me under anesthesia because I'm not perfect. He tasted bile in the back of his throat. Frederick, not another word, said Father. What? Had Father lost his mind? Father ran both of his hands through his hair. He stood and squared his shoulders. He studied Elizabeth, then locked eyes with Frederick. His stare intensified. Listen carefully, Frederick. Elizabeth is right. We will be loyal Germans. But not another word goes against Hitler or the Nazis in this house, said Father. I won't allow it. Frederick gasped. Father, you cannot agree. Father's voice shook with anger. Not another word. Do you understand? In his entire life, Frederick couldn't remember Father ever yelling at him like that. He whispered, Yes. Father picked up a stack of newspapers from one end of the table and slapped them in front of Elizabeth. Everything you need is there. Your baptism papers, mine and your mother's, and your grandparents' marriage notices. You may rest assured that you are 100% German. Now, I have a student coming. I must prepare. Father stormed out of the kitchen. Seconds later, the parlor door slammed. Elizabeth gathered the papers and left the room, humming. Frederick stared at the kitchen doorway long after she disappeared. The tea kettle screamed. Chapter 10. Upstairs in his room, Frederick's mind grappled with all that had just happened. He busied himself to calm his thoughts. He spread a tea towel at one end of his desk and laid out the tools he would need to clean the harmonica. With a tiny screwdriver, he removed the posts that held the cover plates and lifted them off. From downstairs, the familiar sounds of the cello thrummed as Father's student began the lesson. Soon, Frederick heard the prelude from Bach's Cello Suite No. 1. He raised his head to listen to the arpeggios. In the broken chords, he heard the rhythm of Father and Elizabeth's argument. The alternating notes, their banter back and forth, rose and fell. The music was as precise as their conversation had been brittle. As the piece progressed, he felt the gathering tension wind tighter and tighter, like unspoken anxiety. After the movement, a sadness lingered, unresolved. Frederick returned to the harmonica, inspecting the pear wood body and the reed plates. He separated them and lined them up on the towel. He dipped a soft cloth in rubbing alcohol and wiped down the parts. With a small, soft brush, he cleaned the cone. When the reed plates were dry, he screwed them back onto the body, lifting the harmonica to his mouth. He blew into the holes, making the sequential notes of the scale. Frederick repeated the scale, took the harmonica from his lips, and studied it. The third and the eighth, said Elizabeth, standing in his doorway. I agree, Frederick said, looked up. They're flat. You still have a good ear. Years of Father insisting on piano whether I liked it or not. May I come in? He shrugged. She entered, sat on the end of his bed, and looked around. Everything is the same. Frederick scanned the room. She was right. The bed was covered with the quilt he'd had since he was a small boy. The dresser was stacked with sheet music. A framed photo of his mother and father on their wedding day sat on his desk. I like it this way. Of course you do. You were never one for change. Her voice was soft and kind. Did she think she could act as if nothing had happened? Frederick heard Father's muffled voice directing his student downstairs. Then the prelude began again. He took a tiny, sharp tool and made small scrapes on the copper reeds. He blew and scraped a little more. When he was satisfied the harmonica was in tune, he set the cover plates one at a time and tightened the screws. He blew into the harmonica again, running the octave. Elizabeth tilted her head. It doesn't sound like other harmonicas. Frederick agreed. It had a warm and ethereal tone. Too bad it's unacceptable. Like me. Elizabeth tensed. Why can't you understand? I believe in Hitler and what he stands for. He is our benevolent father who is going to lead our country out of darkness and poverty and a watered-down population into greatness and wealth. Again, she sounded like she was reading from the same script as Anselm. I intend to concentrate all of my efforts on the League, she said. They appreciate me. For my knowledge as a nurse, for my moral character and exemplary behavior, I'm somebody to them. You're somebody to us, too, and you don't have to go along with everything they say. You used to have your own feelings and think your own thoughts. These are my feelings now. Besides, the girls are the sisters I never had. We're family. You already have a family. This is different, bigger. The League is a community, and I love being part of it. Elizabeth stared at the quilt on his bed, as if the design were the most interesting thing she'd ever seen. Frederick, have you ever thought about what my childhood was like? The same as mine, said Frederick. No, not exactly. I was only 6 when Mother died. She and I were so close, and I felt lost without her. Father had already quit the orchestra and was working at the factory. A nurse came during the day to care for you, but Father and I took over in the evenings, and when you got older, I walked you to school and picked you up afterwards. I also took care of the house and prepared the meals, all the things a mother would do, but I wasn't a mother. I was just a girl. On weekends, Father taught lessons, so I watched you again. There were no opportunities for me to go on outings, or to a play, or to a school event that was not during school hours. And invitations. There were none. Try being the sister of... Elizabeth bit her lip. Monster boy, said Frederick. I'm sorry. I don't mean to hurt you. Anger and sadness choked Frederick. His words came out stilted. Then why do you say it? Is this your way of being forthright? Because you won't be rewarded for it here. What is wrong with you, Elizabeth? Don't you see? You have hurt Father and me. It's like you're someone we've never met before. She stood, went to the window and gazed out, her eyes transfixed on something Frederick could not see. She turned to him. I am a different person, with a different life. Is that so wrong? When he didn't answer, she shook her head and sighed. I'm going to a League activity this afternoon, if you'd like to come. We're planting crops for a nearby farmer. You see, Frederick, we do good deeds in the community for the sake of our fatherland. Frederick looked at her dumbfounded and shook his head. She walked from the room, closing the door behind her. He raised the harmonica and began to play, trying to replicate the Bach he had heard coming from Father's students downstairs. The unusual instrument sounded as if it carried the pain he felt. Startling, revelation, disappointment, and overpowering sadness. And yet, at the same time, the smooth and elegant tone seemed to swaddle him. He'd been oblivious to Elizabeth's childhood. His face had been her burden, too. How was it that he had never known? He lowered the harmonica and walked to the mirror above the dresser. He stared at the stain looming on his right cheek. A fury unfolded inside him. He threw the harmonica across the room, swept his arms across the dresser, the stacks of sheet music flying. Why had he been born this way? Two. Sunday. The house was hushed except for the ticking cuckoo clock and its spurts of bird calls. Uncle Gunter had made a polite excuse to stay home. Father read in the parlor. Frederick stayed in his room. Elizabeth was preoccupied with becoming someone else. She changed her tailored clothes to old-fashioned dirndl skirt and peasant blouse. She wove her hair into long, thick braids. Even her room changed. Her bed was still covered in the crocheted blankets that their mother had made, but the oil painting of a field of flowers that had always hung above it was replaced by a large poster of an angelic-looking girl and boy in uniforms. They gazed upwards, a swastika radiating light upon their golden hair and perfect faces. That evening, Elizabeth made Frederick and Father's favorite stew with wurst for dinner. As they sat around the table, there was no talk of politics, no arguing. Father and Elizabeth tripped over the niceties of civil conversation, but she didn't say another word to Frederick, nor he to her. Elizabeth was pensive. Father picked at his food. Frederick couldn't eat either. After only a few bites, he pushed away from the table and went upstairs. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, Frederick heard Father pad down the hall and quietly open the door to Elizabeth's room. A moment later, he opened Frederick's and then headed back to his own room. Frederick heard the click of a lamp, the scrape of a chair against the wood floor as it scooted forward, and a few short warm-up strums of the bow across the cello. He felt his heart ache as Father began Brahms' lullaby. When he and Elizabeth were little and couldn't sleep, they would rush into Father's bedroom to beg for a good-night concert. Father always pretended to be too tired, but after they showered him with kisses, he agreed. Shooing them back to their rooms, Father told them to say farewell to their troubles, because they were about to fly away on the wings of the music. "Farewell, farewell," they always squealed, running back to their beds and leaving their doors wide open for the performance. Tonight, Frederick wished it were possible that the heaviness that pressed on his heart and mind might take flight. The song took him back to when Elizabeth had been a constant, always there, whispering in his ear, "Don't listen to others. They're not your family. Your family tells you the truth." All those years. Had she been telling the truth? Father repeated the song 3 times, each version slower and softer and more melancholy. Frederick pulled the quilt over his head. All those years. Had she loved him as he'd love her? The last phrase Father played seemed to mourn the family's unraveling. The final note trembled. Frederick's eyes filled with tears, and he wept. Chapter 12. Elizabeth left early the next morning without saying goodbye. Frederick had been asleep, but even so, she hadn't called out a farewell, or written a note, or asked Father to pass along a message. Had she really disappeared from their lives without a word? She won't be coming back, will she? Frederick asked Father after dinner as he set up his cello in the parlor for his weekly lesson. No, son. At least not soon. Maybe someday. I fear it's all my fault. I always expected so much from her, because she was so capable. I didn't consider her needs as I might have, being wrapped up in my own grief after your mother. I'd always hoped that when I retired, I'd have more time to spend with her. But now it seems I'm too late. She's caught up in that fanatic's idealism. Frederick tightened and rosined his bow. I thought you said you didn't want to hear another word against Hitler in this house. Frederick, surely you know I only said that for Elizabeth's sake. It's important she thinks we're followers, for the safety of all of us. I would do anything to protect you and Elizabeth, even join the Nazi Party if it ever came to that. As much as I hate to admit it, she's right about one thing. If we oppose Hitler, we must keep our thoughts to ourselves. Do you understand? Look and listen. That should be our policy. Trust no one. Be especially careful around the neighbors and at work, except with your uncle, of course. Frederick shook his head. Father, I am not the one. Father raised his hand. I know. I'm far too outspoken and excitable, but I am vowing to hold my tongue and keep my opinions to myself. I said it was time to be prudent, not close my mind altogether. Frederick swept his hand through a candy dish overflowing with anise lozenges. But you continue to shop at the Jewish grocery, don't you? Father sighed. Yes, Frederick. You know it is the only place I can get my lozenges, and that it belongs to the family of one of my students. Besides, this morning the stormtroopers painted a sloppy yellow star on the door and hung a sign. The Jews are Germany's misfortune. I watched 3 customers walk up, reconsider, and turn away. It is not right. Didn't you just say? I said I would keep my opinions to myself, Frederick, and I did. I didn't say one word in that store. I only bought some much-needed groceries. They cannot arrest me for that. At least, not yet. Father walked to the piano and played the A. Frederick drew the bow across the A string, back and forth adjusting the pegs. Before he began his exercises, he looked up. Why do you carry on, Father? For the Jews? Wouldn't it be safer for us to go along with the boycotts? Father walked to him and put a hand on his shoulder. I don't carry on just for the Jews, Frederick. I carry on for you too. Any injustice the Nazis impose on the Jews, they will impose on you or anyone else they deem undesirable. It is unconscionable. Will I have that surgery? Asked Frederick. I already made an appointment with Dr. Braun a week from Friday. We will discuss it. For our safety, let us both promise that from now on. Father put his thumb and forefinger on the corner of his mouth and pretended to zipper it. He smiled close-mouthed. Frederick nodded. I promise. But he doubted Father could keep his word. Chapter 13. 2 days later, Frederick waited at the factory gates after work, pacing in the cold October air. He clapped his arms to stay warm and to tame his anxiety about Father's meeting with Dr. Braun. Father had promised to meet Frederick afterward, so they could walk home together, but he was late. Anselm exited the factory grounds and quickly cornered Frederick. What luck! I was hoping to talk to you. Couldn't Anselm just leave him alone? I'm going to a Hitler Youth meeting next Wednesday, said Anselm. I'm a leader, and I get honored if I bring a guest. Thank you. I'm not interested, said Frederick, avoiding his eyes. Your sister is a good friend of my sister, and she asked. So this was Elizabeth's doing. It's not for me. Frederick took a few steps to the side. Anselm followed. You'll join sooner or later, Frederick, and it would mean ever so much to me and make me look good to my superiors. Come, see how you like it. Frederick knew how he'd like it, but he remembered the promise to father and said nothing. Another time, then, said Anselm, poking his finger into Frederick's shoulder a little too hard. That is my vow, Frederick, to get you to a meeting. He turned and walked away whistling. Frederick clenched his hands. Would Anselm never give up? And Elizabeth? Hadn't he made it clear to her that he didn't want to join? He'd have to dream up some excuses to give Anselm next week. His thoughts were interrupted by two students, a girl and a boy, walking towards him, toting instrument cases. Frederick knew they must be heading home from the conservatory. As they passed, he heard them talking about the Beethoven piece. Which was it? A symphony or a concerto? He wanted to shout at them, I know Beethoven's works too. Instead, he watched them walk away. If he was accepted at the conservatory in January, would they become his friends? Would they mind the way he looked to ridicule him? For the 100th time, he wanted and feared all at once. Where was father? While Frederick waited, he pulled out the harmonica, which he always kept in his chest pocket, and played a passage from Beethoven's Ninth, the fourth movement. With his hands covering part of his face, he was inconspicuous in the dark, just a boy making joyous music on the street. He didn't even mind when people looked his way, because they didn't seem to be looking at his birthmark. Instead, they smiled and nodded as if Frederick had something to say with the harmonica in a language they all understood. Was it the same when others performed? The music was what mattered, and the performer's countenance was secondary. If he was accomplished enough as a musician, could people look beyond his face to his ability? Would the conservatory judges? And maybe one day an audience? The rich sound of the harmonica pervaded his thoughts with an undeniable brightness, as if he were looking at the world through a clear lens. Hope burned like a tiny ember. When he finished, he lowered the harmonica, feeling a satisfied stillness. A man approached and gave him a coin. That was extraordinary, he said, before continuing on. Frederick laughed. He hadn't been playing for money. Frederick! He turned to see father striding toward him, and his joy melted, even from a distance. Frederick could tell he was troubled. Sorry I'm late, said father when he reached him. The meeting with Dr. Braun ran long. Frederick's voice tightened. How did it resolve? Father took a deep breath. We talked at length, but unfortunately his hands are tied. In January, you will be obligated to report what is in your file. He doesn't make the final decision, though. There is something called the Genetic Health Court, which will review every case. They decide. And Dr. Braun says with your birthmark and the epilepsy, match the criteria for the law. Father, what does that mean? Father ran his hands through his hair. I told him my fears about the surgery and about your promising future if you're accepted to the conservatory. He's known of your talent since you were small. He said if you were admitted, we can ask a conservatory representative to write a letter on your behalf, a dispensation letter. Apparently Hitler and the Nazis make concessions for loyal and true Germans of great aptitude. Your musical ability could be your saving grace. Frederick took father's arm, holding on to him as he grasped the possibility that musicianship might save him. They began to slowly walk home. And if I'm not accepted to the conservatory, I must have the surgery. Father nodded. The government will insist with force if necessary. But in that event, son, be reassured, I will go to the authorities myself. What would happen if father made a scene with the authorities? Frederick shook his head. You cannot pound on someone's desk as you did when I was little, father. This is a law. They are putting people in prison for speaking out against the government. Frederick tried to keep his voice low as they walked. Father, if I do not get accepted, you must promise me that you will not... Frederick, I could never stand by and let this happen. Tension was building in father's voice. You are brilliant and kind and responsible and talented and now this law. Why can't people just accept you and look on the inside of you? I couldn't live with myself if they... Father's face crumbled. There must be something I can do. Frederick put an arm around father and pretended to be calm. You can coach me and oversee my practice. Let's look at scores tonight so that I might start considering pieces for audition, yes? Father nodded. But that might not be enough. There must be something more I can do. His words trailed off into the darkness. All his life, father had protected him, defended him, opened doors for him. But now, something bigger and uncontrollable had shaken father's strength and resolve. An unfamiliar fear gripped Frederick. He was falling. If father wasn't below to catch him, could he catch himself? And that is where we will end today.